Hello and welcome. I'm Fahd Husain. There is cautious optimism tonight that diplomacy may be back on the table. Iran's foreign minister is expected in Islamabad shortly with fresh efforts underway to restart talks between the US and Iran, talks that of course Pakistan is helping to facilitate. This conflict has already disrupted global energy flows, shaken markets and raised serious questions about how much control even the most powerful countries really have. Because this is not just a war between adversaries, it is a moment that is testing the limits of power in an increasingly uncertain world. To make sense of this, we are joined tonight by one of the most influential voices in global affairs. Fareed Zakaria is the host of Fareed Zakaria GPS on CNN, a long-time columnist for the Washington Post, and the author of several widely read best-selling books, Age of Revolutions, where he examines how waves of changes are reshaping power and politics across the world. His work has shaped how global audiences understand moments like this, when conflict, strategy, and uncertainty collide. And tonight, for the first time on a Pakistani channel, he joins us from New York. Fareed Zakaria, welcome to our show.
Great pleasure to be with you.
Actually, strictly, it's not true that this is the first time that we are talking, because it was about 20 years ago. I was on another channel that we had the pleasure of having you. But it's wonderful to speak with you again after such a long time, at a moment where, of course, so much is happening to change the world. So I want to start with just asking you the significance of this latest development that has happened with the Iranian foreign minister coming to Pakistan and then going to Oman and Russia. Seems like finally some diplomatic movement at a stage where everything seemed to be kind of frozen for a couple of days. Do you sense that prospects for talks between the US and Iran are now gradually brightening?
Yes, I think that basically this is a hopeful sign. It's a very odd negotiation that is taking place between Iran and the United States, in that both parties seem to want a deal. I say that because I think it's clear by now that Donald Trump got into something that was more complicated than he imagined. He was sold on an idea that you bomb Iran for a few days, the regime will collapse, you will be the liberator of Iran. Well, that clearly hasn't happened. And yes, the U.S. military is extraordinarily powerful, but he's sort of in a sense in that you cannot get to the outcome you want, which is an Iranian surrender. For Iran, on the other hand, this has been the most devastating blow to their military, to their nuclear program, to their basic command and control systems ever, since the Islamic Republic was formed. The economy is in extremely bad shape, and already we know there was public discontent. So both sides, in a sense, need a deal, but they are finding it very hard to get to yes. Why? Because there is 47 years of accumulated mistrust. They don't trust each other's negotiators. They don't believe that when the Iranian foreign minister makes a concession, he's speaking for the Revolutionary Guard. For the Iranian side, they mistrust the two American negotiators, Witkoff and Kushner, because they have twice been negotiating with them, and the United States, in the middle of the negotiations, started bombing. So you can understand, if you want to just be objective about it, both sides have legitimate reasons to be distrustful. So they're trying to get to a deal, but they can't get to yes. They keep getting to no or an obstacle instead, which is why, quite frankly, Pakistan's mediation has been very positive and very helpful, because you need some facilitator when you have this much accumulated mistrust. I still think probably, most likely, they will get to a deal, but you could easily see a miscalculation that throws the whole thing back into violence.
If you look at the two positions, of course, what the official position of the US president, what the Iranians are saying, clearly there's a lot of gap, not just in terms of the nuclear issue, but also about sanctions relief, about funds being unfrozen, about the US naval blockade, and about this new reality where Iran is now using the Straits of Hormuz as a strategic weapon, for lack of a better word. So with this divergence in views and the almost like a knife's edge kind of a situation where we are at right now, do you feel that there is enough pressure in Washington to somehow move beyond their stated position and try and reach somewhere in the middle so that this conflict starts to see the beginning of the end?
Look, there should be, because Trump is actually a fairly practical person in general. On this issue, he seems to have gotten very ideologically charged. And to be fair, has always seemed very much that way. That's why he pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. He's going to struggle to get something better than the Iran nuclear deal. I think that's the problem on the Trump side. He cannot accept that he went through all this, high drama, pulling out of the nuclear deal, bombing the nuclear program, bombing Iran, essentially going to war with Iran. And all he ends up with is what Obama was able to get through negotiations. So he's going to have to find a way to be able to claim that what he has is better than the Iran nuclear deal. It's possible the Iranians actually were floating a few interesting proposals the last time around before the war began, in which it seemed that they recognized that Trump needed something like that. And they were making certain offers, and they're hinted at by the Omani foreign minister, who was at the time the intermediary. But the Trump has to accept that he'll have to give something as well. As you pointed out correctly, there's sanctions relief issues that the Iranians are interested in. There's even maybe the resumption of some degree of diplomatic relations. And as I say, ordinarily, Trump would be the person you would expect he'd be able to do this. If you watch his negotiations on China from 2016 to the present, he's been extraordinarily practical. He started out, China was the enemy, demonizing it. He's ended up in a place where he's much more practical. Will he get there on Iran? That is the fundamental issue. There is also an issue that the Iranians are divided. The Revolutionary Guard is mostly in control, and they've been the hardliners. They also don't like to give concessions. In both cases, you have two sides are backed into corners where, out of a sense of pride and dignity, they don't want to make concessions. Yet the only way you're going to get a deal, as any negotiator knows, is both sides have to give a little.
And that, of course, is something that is desperately required, given the kind of adverse impact that this whole conflict is having on not just the US but everywhere else. Now, Mr. Fareed Zakaria, if I were to take this war and frame it in the larger analytical framework that you use in your writings, in your programs, your latest book, The Age of Revolution, also talks about that, and how revolutions lead to disruption, then anxiety, then backlash, then reordering. And you've analyzed, the way things are evolving currently into this framework. So the old order, which you have argued, the post-1945 order, American-led order, which was based on strong institutions, alliances, etc., that order is now under threat, or maybe it is weakening. And one of the reasons that you mention is the fact that the leader of this order, the United States, is now in many ways wasting the power that it has and diluting it. While the rise of the rest, as you have argued for a long time, is now manifesting itself in global politics. So this transition from that order, which I know that you still believe that is the best possible one, but we are seeing that transform into something else. Is this war that we are seeing an actual manifestation of this transformation from the old to the new?
Absolutely. This war represents a kind of turning point because what the United States is doing is it is not basing its military actions on any sense that it is upholding an international order, rules-based system, working within the UN architecture, working with its historical allies. None of that. If you compare this to the Bush war in Iraq, Bush went to the United Nations twice. He got UN resolutions. He got UN inspectors. He went to Congress. He went to the allies. He assembled a coalition of 45 nations, I think. Many of the forces were, at some point placed under UN control. They worked with the UN the whole time. They brought in outside international organizations. The whole idea was to frame that conflict as part of establishing and strengthening international order. In this case, Trump has refused to go to the UN, didn't even go to Congress, went to none of America's allies except one, Israel. Even the Gulf allies were not involved in this, and it's done in an almost transactional way. To me, the symbol of that was where at one point when Trump said, "Look, maybe the Strait of Hormuz will be something jointly run by the United States and Iran, and will share in the tolls." Now that you could not imagine the old America, which believed in freedom of navigation, which believed that that was a core principle of an open international system, saying, yeah, it's okay to block one of the most vital passageways in the world as long as we get a cut. And in a sense, look, Trump is giving voice to a certain feeling in a part of the American population that we have been bearing these burdens too long. We have been the upholder of order for too long, and we need to just act in a kind of, self-interested, short-term, transactional way. I don't think the support is that strong. One thing to remember with Trump is he is right now the most unpopular president in American history. He's more unpopular than Richard Nixon was when he resigned after Watergate. But there is a substantial base of support, 35% of the country, that really believes in what he's doing. So he does represent that feeling that you correctly describe in my last book of a kind of backlash of against this whole world of globalization and international rules and norms, and that's something that's reshaping the world, because if the United States pulls back, no one else is going to step forward. The Chinese don't have the desire or even the capacity at this stage. Nobody else can do it. The European Union is too fragmented. So you'll end up in a world of instability, volatility, and individual transactions rather than institutions, process, and a kind of a longer-term stability.
I'm glad actually you mentioned that, because I was about to come to that. I know that you've recently been to China, and you've seen firsthand what is happening there, the rise of China, and you've admired the way that they are growing quietly, as opposed to the boisterous way that the US is flaunting its leadership. I also know that you're not very enamored by Russia, even though that is one of the key powers here. So if you look at the alternative, and again, quoting you, I know that you've argued that the post-1945 order might have had many problems, and you acknowledge the problems, that it was stability when you looked at it from Washington. But when you looked at that global order from, let's say, Islamabad, you wouldn't see that kind of stability, and you would see double standards and so many other things which led to that order being challenged as a source of stability, and you acknowledge that. But your argument is that however flawed that is, it is still better than the alternative. And the alternative is not there, but what we are looking at is China, in a way, projecting an alternative which may be a couple of years, couple of decades down the line, but it is projecting an image, and that order, new order yet to be born, says that it's going to be very different from this one. So between these two orders is this chaos that we are talking about. And in that chaos, the winners of the old order may not be the beneficiaries of this sort of interim period, and which is why we are seeing the rise of middle powers. Would you agree with that?
Yes, 100%. By the way, I will point out Pakistan did all right under the old order. But to your larger point, look, the difference I would describe between Russia and China is an important one to understand. Russia is trying to assert its return to great power status, if you will, entirely through its military power, through an aggressive war of conquest in Ukraine, while it is running its economy into the ground. Russia already had been running its economy into the ground. It was barely, I mean, the Russian economy is basically a little larger than the economy of the Netherlands, with 17 million people in the Netherlands and 150 million people in Russia. But what it was doing was destabilizing, disrupting, trying to tear up the international stability. China is very different. China has benefited from, international order, openness, trade, commerce, the world of free trade and capitalism. China has been probably the principal beneficiary of globalization over the last 30 or 40 years. It knows that very well. It wants to further that. And therefore, the way it plays even into these crises where the United States, in my opinion, is squandering its power, China is slowly but surely continuing to build its economic strength, its industrial model, its economic influence by now recognizing that the world wants to have some diversification from fossil fuels, oil and gas. So who is the dominant player in solar? Who is the dominant player in wind? Who is the dominant player in nuclear? Who is the dominant player in batteries? China in all of them. So China is offering new loans and new technologies to all these countries. You see how different those patterns are. One is, in a sense, a much more constructive, stabilizing force, and the other, Russia, is a destabilizing force. But the challenge for the middle powers, the countries like Canada, Brazil, India, Pakistan, is can you live in a world where you have good relations with both the United States and China? I think this is going to be the fundamental strategic challenge of every middle power. And I think Pakistan is right in there. You have good relations, very good relations with China, but you have historic ties with the United States, and you are trying to balance those two. India has very good ties, not with China, but with Russia, and yet strong and strengthening ties with America. You think about, even the Canadians have just signed a free trade deal with China to lessen their dependence on the American market so that America cannot wield the club the way that Trump is. So this is going to be the dance that everybody plays. As China rises, you're going to see more of that. And America is going to stay very strong. So it's not as though the story of America is not the story of Great Britain. To give you one simple statistic, at the end of World War II, when Britain still had this huge empire, India, Pakistan, the whole of South Asia, Kenya, the Sudan, all of that, Britain was 5% of global GDP. Today, the United States is 25% of global GDP, 5 times that number. So the US remains the single most powerful economy in the world, and will probably remain that for a while. So it's a very different story. The story of Britain was of collapse and decline. The story of US is kind of plateauing while China rises, and they become two equivalent forces in the world, each having their own strengths, and the rest of the world having to navigate between those two, just as Pakistan is trying to do.
And so finally, I think that's a good point for me to just try and wrap up our discussion. Looking ahead, Mr. Fareed Zakaria, if we've agreed that there's this major transformation happening where the US-led order is now struggling because of a number of policies that you feel that the Americans have have followed, as a result of which they squandered the awesome power that they've had in many ways. And we are in the middle where states who can negotiate or find good ties with the key power centers would be able to find very important leverage for themselves in this era that we are in right now. So based on that, and given the fact that this war, whenever it comes to an end, will leave the United States probably a little more humble than it was before the war, for the reasons that you've outlined, and would also leave this entire region fractured and weaker, and perhaps the Gulf economies changed in ways that they couldn't have imagined. And suddenly you have countries in this new order who are not being seen in terms of the old order parameters, like democracy, like rule of law, etc., etc., all those things that were represented as part of global policy. So, countries like Pakistan, who've kind of fared well in this era by connecting with key people and being a little nimble in their diplomacy, do you think new countries will come on the world stage and recreate global dynamics in the short to medium term? I'm of course not looking at like too far ahead in the future.
It's a very good question. Look, there's always a role for countries that can punch above their weight. And there are various ones that have been able to do it. Pakistan perhaps is now doing it. But ultimately, the real path to sustained power and influence on the world stage is economic growth and technological progress. You have to be, you have to have the weight on the world stage to have a voice. Otherwise, yes, you can somehow find a way by hook or by crook, by inserting yourself in a situation, by clever diplomacy of doing something. But the sustained path to global influence and power is frankly the path to lifting the lives of your people. And that has always been the most important source of strength. If you look back over 400 or 500 years of history, the way great powers rise and stay in the top ranks of the world is by being technologically innovative, by being economically dynamic, by raising the standard of living, by raising per capita GDP, by looking after their people, which then produces the kind of economic growth and technological dynamism which allows the country to translate that onto the global stage. And I think that's an area where Pakistan needs to pay more attention. There is a skill to Pakistan's diplomacy, which I acknowledge and respect. But the fundamental task of any government is to raise the standards of living of its people. 20 years ago, India's economy was 5 times the size of Pakistan's. Today, it's 10 times the size of Pakistan's. That should be as motivating a factor for Pakistan as whether it's able to hold peace talks and award peace prizes.
In addition to, of course, the fact that in this new order, I completely agree with you that economy is the key, and Pakistan has to really up its game in that front. But given the fact that we've found new diplomatic heft, I think that should be leveraged for improving our economy, and I think that's a broad consensus here in Pakistan that we really need to get our act together in terms of that. But overall, I think your analysis it makes a whole lot of sense, and of course, when we look at the world from Islamabad, oftentimes it looks a little different from the way that you look at it from Washington, but the overall principles of geopolitics and geostrategy remain the same. So we are very grateful that you joined us today, Mr. Fareed Zakaria. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.